There is a particular kind of silence that only exists in hospital hallways at 2 in the afternoon. Not the silence of peace, not the silence of sleep. It is the silence of people trying very hard not to say the things they are actually thinking. Machines hum behind closed doors. Shoes squeak against linoleum floors that have been mopped so many times they have lost whatever color they once were. Somewhere down the corridor, someone is crying quietly, the way people cry when they have been crying for a long time and no longer have the energy to do it properly. Colt Maddox stood in that hallway and did not move. He was a large man, 6 feet 3 inches of road-earned gravity and weathered stillness. And he stood the way large men stand when they are working very hard to hold something inside. His leather vest hung open over a gray Henley. His hands, which had rebuilt more engines than most men had owned, were loose at his sides. Not clenched, deliberately not clenched. Through the narrow window in the door ahead of him, he could see her. Dorothea Maddox, 76 years old, his mother. She was lying in the hospital bed with her eyes closed and a bandage wrapped around her right ear, white gauze already showing the pale rust of dried blood at the center. Her powder blue uniform was stained with coffee and something darker. Her hands folded on the blanket over her chest were the hands of a woman who had worked every day of her adult life and wore that fact without apology. She looked small in that bed. Colt had not seen his mother look small in a very long time. He stood there for 37 seconds. He counted them without meaning to, the way you count things when your mind is trying to stay useful while the rest of you is somewhere else entirely. Then he pushed the door open and walked inside. She heard him before she saw him. Her eyes opened and she turned her head carefully because turning too fast hurt. She looked at him the way mothers look at their sons when they want to appear fine and cannot quite manage it. She tried to smile. Colt crossed the room in 4 steps and lowered himself to one knee beside the bed. He said very quietly, "Mom, show me." She turned her head further and he looked at the bandage. He looked at the swelling around it, the bruising that was already deepening along her jawline from where someone had grabbed her face and held it in place. He looked at the careful work of the nurses, and beneath that, the evidence of what had required it. He said, his voice barely above a whisper, "Who did this?" She said it was nothing, just some boys being stupid. He said very carefully, "This is not nothing." She watched his face. She had been watching his face for 58 years. She knew every variation of what it could do. She said the name, Tanner Farrell. Colt closed his eyes, not in surprise, in recognition, in the particular exhaustion of a man who has spent 30 years half waiting for something he hoped would never arrive, and has just learned that hope was never the right instrument for the job. He opened his eyes and kissed her forehead gently, the way you handle something you understand the value of. He told her he would be back. He told her chains would stay outside her room. He told her not to worry. She told him not to make trouble. He walked back out into the hallway and stood there again, and this time the silence had a different quality. It had shape. It had weight. It pressed against the back of his throat and the inside of his ribs, and he breathed through it the way he had learned to breathe through things over a lifetime of situations that required it. His father used to say that a man's character is what he does when everything is on the line and nobody is watching. Colt Maddox had been away from Silver Ridge for 30 years. He was done being away. The thought that would surface again and again over the days that followed came to him first in that hallway worn smooth as riverstone from years of being carried without being spoken. My father left me 2 things, a promise I was slow to keep, and a town that paid the price for my silence. Cut back 14 hours earlier. The sun had not yet cleared the Sierra Nevada peaks when Dorothea Maddox's alarm clock went off at 5:45 in the morning. She silenced it with the easy motion of someone who had been waking at exactly this hour for 4 decades. The bedroom was still dark, but she did not need light to navigate the small ranch house on Sagebrush Lane. Her feet knew every board, every worn patch of carpet, every particular creak that meant she was near the door and should step slightly left to avoid disturbing anyone, though there was no one left to disturb. She sat on the edge of the bed and let her joints remember their purpose. At 76, she had learned that rushing led to falling, and falling at her age meant hospitals and worry, and her son making a long drive in the dark with that look on his face. She reached for the lamp on the nightstand. Its base was shaped like an old-fashioned lantern. Colt had given it to her 3 Christmases ago, slightly apologetic about the wrapping, the way he was always slightly apologetic about gestures that revealed how much he paid attention. The warm light caught the silver frame on the dresser across the room. Fletcher Maddox looked back at her from a photograph taken in 1987. He was standing in front of a motorcycle with his arms crossed and a slight smile at the corners of his mouth. The smile that said he knew something you did not, but he would never lord it over you. He had been dead for 11 years. She still said good morning to him every day and felt nothing foolish about it. "Morning, Fletcher," she said quietly. "Another day." Then she got up and made it happen. She moved through her morning with the quiet efficiency of a person who found genuine comfort in doing things correctly and in the same order. Shower. Dress in her powder blue uniform, with her name embroidered over the left pocket, though everyone in Silver Ridge had known exactly who she was for the better part of a decade. Hair pinned back. Sensible shoes that had logged approximately 40,000 miles of diner floor and showed it honestly. A touch of lipstick, coral, because Fletcher had always said it brought out her smile, and there was no reason to stop now. In the kitchen, 2 eggs scrambled because her cholesterol was a consideration she took seriously, if not joyfully. 1 slice of whole wheat toast. Black coffee in the mug Colt had made in a high school pottery class, slightly lopsided and worth more to her than anything she owned that wasn't. She ate at the counter and looked out at her small backyard where the rose bushes were telling her they needed attention. She made a note. She was always making notes about things that needed attention. It was, she had decided, the most honest definition of being alive. She checked her watch. 7:15, time to go. The drive to Crestline Diner took 11 minutes, the same 11 minutes it had taken for 8 years. Her 2009 Ford F-150, which had been Fletcher's truck and was now hers by inheritance, and a stubborn refusal to change what still worked, grumbled to life with the familiar diesel complaint of something that knew its age but declined to act it. Silver Ridge spread around her as she drove laid out along Highway 50 in the high desert, the way small Nevada towns had always been laid out, like they had stopped for a moment on the way to somewhere else and decided to stay. The loneliest road in America. That was what the travel guides called Highway 50. The locals had a different name for it. They called it home. At this hour, downtown Silver Ridge had the particular beauty of a place not yet fully awake. The sun was coming over the mountains in shades of amber, in pale gold, painting the old false front buildings on Main Street, in the kind of light that made everything look like it had always been there and always would be. Mitchell's Bakery was open already, the smell of fresh bread and cinnamon reaching the sidewalk the way it had every morning for 3 decades. Dalton's Hardware had a new window display. Someone had arranged garden tools with obvious care and a professional sense of composition. She pulled into the bakery's small lot. On the sidewalk out front, Walt Garber was loading supplies into the bed of his pickup. Dutch people had called him for 40 years since his time at sea. He was 72 years old and still had the build of a man who had spent half a century with his hands in hard work. He looked up when Dot rolled down her window, and his face arranged itself into the comfortable recognition of someone who had known her long enough not to need formality. She asked how he was doing. He said fair to middling, which was his answer for everything from a good day to a day when his back was making its opinions known. He pressed a hand to his lower back as if to illustrate. She said she was sorry about his shop. She said it gently, the way you say things that are true and painful at once. His face changed, just slightly, the shift of a man who has been carrying something and hasn't decided how much of it to put down. 3 weeks ago, he said, his voice careful, "They're not going to stop Dot, not unless something changes." She said something might change sooner than they think. He looked at her for a moment, reading her face the way people who have known each other long enough learn to read faces rather than words. Then he told her Martha had bear claws this morning, her favorite. She said she knew, and she was already on her way. Inside the bakery, Martha had a white box waiting on the counter without being asked. A dozen bear claws, 2 apple fritters, and a handful of extra cinnamon rolls because Wendell had mentioned business was strong, and Martha believed that good news deserved to be met in kind. They talked for a few minutes the way women who have known each other for 30 years sometimes do, covering nothing important and everything that mattered in the same breath. Then Dot was back in the truck, the bakery box balanced on the passenger seat, the 11 minutes of familiar road ahead of her. She was 76 years old. She had survived the death of her husband. She had survived the years when Colt rode away, and she did not know where he was or whether he was safe. She had survived the small indignities of aging with her spine intact and her sense of humor largely undamaged. She had survived because she understood something about the architecture of a life, that it was built on these small moments. These brief exchanges at bakery counters and hardware store sidewalks these mornings that began the same as every other morning and confirmed that you were still here, still connected, still part of something larger than yourself. She parked behind the diner and let herself in through the back door at 7:45, exactly as she always did. 40 miles outside Silver Ridge, the Iron Covenant Riders compound sat on 5 acres of hard scrubland that the desert had been accommodating for 20 years. The main building was prefab metal with additions made over time as the chapter grew, and it looked from the road exactly like what it was, a working space for people who took their work seriously. Inside, tools hung on pegboards in precise arrangements. Motorcycles in various stages of restoration occupied the main floor. A long table at the back served as the meeting space when chapter business required it. On one wall, an American flag. On another, the Iron Covenant banner, a chain-link shield in black and silver, the design Fletcher Maddox had drawn on a paper napkin in 1971 and had made permanent shortly after. On the third wall, photographs documenting the chapter's history, and among them near the beginning of the chronological arrangement, several marked with black ribbons. Brothers who had ridden their last mile. Fletcher Maddox was in the oldest photographs. In those early images, he looked like a man who had seen enough of the world to stop being surprised by it and had decided instead to build something worth keeping. He had learned that disposition in Korea, brought it home, and spent the rest of his life practicing it. Colt Maddox had his father's hands in his father's eyes, in his father's particular quality of going still when something was wrong, not frozen, like a machine shifting into neutral, all the energy redirecting inward to somewhere it could be used. At 8 in the morning, he was working on the carburetor of a 1995 Heritage Softail belonging to one of the chapter's newer members, a bike that had been bought with more enthusiasm than mechanical understanding and was now receiving the careful attention it had always deserved. Colt worked with the focused patience of a man who had learned long ago that engines were honest. They told you exactly what was wrong if you were willing to listen without assuming you already knew the answer. Decker Pruitt, who had answered to Chains for so long that his given name felt like something belonging to a different person, was across the garage rebuilding a transmission with the rangy, economical motion of someone who had been doing this for decades and no longer needed to think about the sequence. His vest was covered in pins from every state they had ridden through, a quiet record of distances. Bishop Waverly sat on a stool near the back wall with a parts manual and his reading glasses, the Gulf War calm that never fully left him evident in the way he held himself, the particular stillness of a man who had been in situations where stillness was the difference between good outcomes and bad ones. Vasquez Skaggs diesel, to everyone in and out of the chapter, was replacing fork seals with the systematic efficiency of someone who had performed the same job several hundred times and found something meditative in the repetition. It was a Tuesday morning in October. It was as far as any of them knew an ordinary day. Colt's phone rang. He wiped his hands on the shop rag and looked at the screen. Local number, not saved. He almost let it go. Then something made him answer, instinct or habit, or the particular attentiveness of a man who had spent years in situations where the phone you did not answer first could matter. He said, "Yeah." The voice on the other end was Wendell Okafor, and it was not right. It had the tight, controlled quality of a man holding himself together over something that wanted to come apart. Colt, Wendell said. "You need to come. It's about Dorothea." Everything in Colt went still. He said very quietly, "What happened to my mother?" Wendell told him. Colt did not remember ending the call. He was standing in the middle of the garage floor with the phone in his hand, and the rest of the world receded to something distant and secondary, like a radio playing in another room. Around him, the chapter continued its ordinary Tuesday morning. He stood in the center of it and felt something clarify inside him, the way a photograph clarifies as it develops, shapes resolving from gray uncertainty into something that could be seen plainly. He walked to the wall where Fletcher's photograph hung. He touched the frame, a brief motion quick enough that someone watching might have missed it. The others did not miss it. They had ridden with Ironside Maddox for too many years to miss the things that mattered. He turned around. "Chains," he said. "Diesel, Bishop." His voice was quiet. It carried the weight of something decided. "Gear up. We ride now." Chains looked up from the transmission. He saw Colt's face and stood without asking questions. In 23 years of brotherhood, he had seen Colt in most of his configurations calm and furious, patient and decisive. What he saw now was something specific that he had not seen before, or had seen only twice before on occasions he would not forget. It was the expression of a man who had received news that had answered a question he had been living alongside for a long time, and who had simultaneously understood what the answer required of him. "Someone hurt my mother," Colt said, "and they're about to learn what that means." He went to his locker and took out his vest. President, Iron Covenant Riders, Nevada chapter. He put it on with the ease of long practice and checked the Colt 1911 in his shoulder holster by habit and walked toward his bike. The 4 Harleys rolled out of the gate in the late morning sun, and there was nothing theatrical about it. No rowing engines, no announcement. Just 4 men on 4 machines heading west on Highway 50 toward a small town where something had gone wrong. Some debts, Colt thought, as the road opened ahead of him, do not disappear just because you ride away from them. Back in Silver Ridge at Crestline Diner, the morning had been moving along with the rhythmic reliability that Dodd had always found sustaining. The early crowd of ranchers and regulars, the coffee and conversation, and careful communion of a place that had been doing the same thing in the same way for long enough that it had become something beyond a business. It had become a kind of institution, small and unassuming, but real. Wendell worked the grill with the white paper cap that had gone out of fashion before Dot started working here, and that he wore anyway because it was his diner and he would decide what was fashionable in it. He had accepted the bear claws with appropriate ceremony and made fresh coffee, and the morning proceeded. By 10 o'clock, the diner had settled into its mid-morning quiet. The breakfast rush had thinned. The lunch crowd was still an hour away. The booths held the comfortable scatter of people with nowhere urgent to be, and the particular ease of regulars who had been coming here long enough to feel they had some small claim on the place. In the corner booth, Agatha Whitfield was doing what she did most Tuesday mornings, which was sitting with coffee and the kind of quiet attention that had characterized her for 37 years in classrooms and had not left her in retirement. She was 68 years old and she noticed things. It was not a skill she had chosen so much as a disposition she had been born with, in which decades of teaching had refined into something close to an instrument. She noticed when her students were struggling before they knew how to say so. She noticed when institutional patterns were wrong before anyone with the authority to act on it had admitted it. She had been noticing what was happening to Silver Ridge for 3 years and had been writing it down in a systematic way that a retired teacher who understood documentation tended to write things down carefully and completely and without assuming that anyone would come to ask for it in time. She had 2 banker's boxes at home that contained the record of what she had noticed. She had been waiting with the patient practicality of someone who had spent decades understanding that the right moment mattered as much as the right information for someone who could use them. She was thinking about this when the bell above the diner door changed the morning. She looked up. 4 young men came through the door, and she noted them the way she noted everything, with the quiet registering attention that did not look like attention from the outside. She had seen Tanner Farrell before. Silver Ridge was 4,000 people, and she had been a presence in it for 40 years. She knew who he was, and she knew who his father was, and she knew the particular quality that Tanner carried when he had been drinking, which was the quality of someone who had learned very early that there were no consequences for him and had never had reason to revise that understanding. He was drinking now at 10:30 in the morning. She watched them take the large corner booth. She watched Dot approach with her order pad and her professional smile, the smile Dot had been maintaining through difficult customers for 40 years, and which revealed nothing except competence and patience. She watched the deliberate escalation of the coffee, and then she saw Marcus Doyle begin to move around behind Dot, and she understood what was happening before it happened, and she reached under the table for her phone. She opened the camera. She kept it below the table's edge, angled carefully, her thumb on the record button. She recorded everything. She recorded the container in Tanner's hand and what was in it. She recorded the moment Marcus's hands closed on Dot's shoulders and the way Dot's posture changed when she understood she could not move. She recorded Tanner's face as he removed the lid. She kept her hands steady because she was a woman who understood that shaking hands produced unusable footage. And that unusable footage helped no one. And she kept them steady through the sound that Dot made when the centipede entered her ear, a sound that moved through the diner like something physical, a sound that Agatha Whitfield would hear again in the particular quiet of 4 in the morning for a long time after. When Tanner and his crew walked out, Kyle still narrating for whatever audience he imagined watching on his phone, Agatha had 43 seconds of clear, continuous recording. She opened AirDrop. The list of nearby devices showed names she recognized as regulars and ones she did not. An unnamed device operating close enough to appear on the list. She did not know whose it was. She sent the video to every device on the list without stopping to find out. Then she called 911 and reported an assault at Crestline Diner and gave her name and spelled it because she had taught long enough to understand the importance of being legible in the record. She set the phone down on the table. She looked at Dot on the floor with both hands pressed to her ear, and she stood up from the corner booth and walked to her because someone needed to, and the decision about who that would be had apparently already been made. The black sedan had been parked on Main Street for 3 weeks. This was the kind of information that moved through a town of 4,000, the way most information moved in small increments through daily conversation accumulated across diner counters and parking lot exchanges until it became general knowledge without ever having been formally announced. Several people had noticed. Several people had formed opinions. The car's particular quality of deliberate neutrality, its rental lot cleanliness, the angle of its parking that allowed clear sightlines in both directions had the effect of discouraging direct inquiry in a way that was itself informative to anyone paying attention. Agent Darla Westbrook had been with the FBI for 19 years, the last 3 as regional director out of the Reno field office. She was in Silver Ridge because of Crestline Properties LLC, a Nevada-registered development company with a Delaware holding structure, and a pattern of property acquisitions that was interesting for reasons that compounded the longer you examine them. 17 properties in Elko and Lander counties over 8 years acquired at prices between 20 and 40% below market value from owners who had, in every documented case, experienced sudden regulatory or financial difficulties in the months preceding the sale. The pattern was clear once you knew to look for it. The challenge was constructing a case that connected Crestline's beneficial owners to the pressure being applied to sellers and doing it in a way that held up in federal court. She had been 3 weeks away from having enough when the airdrop notification appeared on her phone at 10:44 in the morning. She opened the file. She watched it once. Then she watched it again more slowly. Then she called the assistant U.S. attorney in Reno and said in the careful, level tone of someone trained not to inject personal feeling into professional communications, "I need you to know that something just happened that changes our timeline significantly." She had been parked on Main Street watching for a pattern that connected financial documents to human decisions. What had just arrived on her phone was something more immediate and more devastating, and it connected to her existing case in a way that was, she would tell her supervisor later, either the most significant coincidence she had encountered in 19 years, or was precisely what it looked like, which was a system finally being asked to account for what it had been doing. The video file from Agatha Whitfield's phone would within 72 hours be combined with the audio from the sedan's surveillance equipment, the financial records already subpoenaed, and the corporate documents already obtained to form the foundation of a federal case that the assistant U.S. attorney would describe as the cleanest thing to land on her desk in recent memory. All of it was already in motion before Colt Maddox's phone rang. All of it existed before he knew what had been done to his mother. Tanner Farrell and his friends walked out of Crestline Diner and across the parking lot, and none of them noticed the sedan. None of them noticed the woman behind the wheel who did not look up. None of them understood that every word spoken in that diner, every movement recorded on Agatha's phone and on Kyle Sutton's phone, which was now also in evidence, had already traveled to a federal server in Reno and would still be there long after the morning felt over. Inside the diner, Wendell Okafor was kneeling beside Dot Maddox on the floor, his hands hovering with the helplessness of a man who wanted urgently to do something and did not know what the something was. Agatha was beside him, one hand on Dot's back, steady and present. Wendell said, "We need to get you to the hospital." Dot said yes, she could manage that. She had managed things before. He helped her up. She swayed and found her footing and pressed the heel of her hand to her ear. She looked around the diner at 40 people who had watched what happened and had not moved, and she did not blame them because she understood exactly why they had not moved, and that understanding sat alongside the pain in its own way. Wendell's call to Colt went through at 11:06 in the morning. By 11:13, 4 motorcycles were rolling out of the Iron Covenant compound and onto Highway 50. There is a second thing to know about Sheriff Silas Colfax, and it is this. His official duty log for the morning of October 8th recorded him responding to a reported altercation involving 2 vehicles on Route 9 approximately 14 miles southeast of Silver Ridge between 9:45 and 11:15. The entry was detailed in the way of someone who understood that detail created the impression of reliability. Mileage notations, a description of the vehicles involved, a case number that would resolve on examination to a file containing nothing substantive. Chains Pruitt and Diesel Skaggs had been on that exact stretch of Route 9 that morning, from 8 o'clock until nearly 11, doing roadside work on a trailer hitch that had failed on one of the chapter's support vehicles. They were parked on the shoulder for nearly 3 hours. They had not seen a sheriff's vehicle. They had not seen any altercation. They had seen the same empty stretch of Nevada road that was always there. When Chains mentioned this to Colt later that afternoon outside the hospital, Colt listened without expression and asked if he was certain of the timeline. Chains said he had texted Bishop at 9:52 about a tool he needed, and Bishop had texted back from the compound, and the timestamps were not subject to interpretation. Colt was quiet for a moment. He said that log was filed before he left the office. Chains said so he knew what was going to happen. Colt said he knew enough to make sure he was somewhere else when it did. The distinction mattered. A man who failed to act when called was a coward. A man who arranged his own alibi in advance of an assault was something more deliberate and more damning. Sheriff Silas Colfax had not simply looked away from what Tanner Farrell did in Crestline Diner. He had made a decision at some earlier point in some earlier conversation to ensure that his absence on that morning was documented and official. He had constructed his non-involvement before the event that required it. Colt filed this information in the organized space in the back of his mind where things went when they were important and needed to be used correctly. He had spent years learning to be patient with information, to let it sit until its full shape became visible, to resist the temptation of doing something with it before you understood precisely what it was. He had three things now, and each of them pointed in the same direction. Wendell's account of what happened in the diner, his mother in a hospital room with a bandaged ear, and the knowledge that the man responsible for law enforcement in Silver Ridge had prepared for his own irrelevance before it was required. The four Harleys reached the Silver Ridge city limits at 12:48. Colt slowed the pack as they entered town. No need for noise, no need for anything that announced itself as more than it was. They were not here to perform. They were here to understand what had happened and to determine what it required in that sequence, with whatever patience the situation could be made to allow. He pulled to the curb in front of Crestline Diner. A cluster of people stood on the sidewalk, talking in the low, careful tones of witnesses who have seen something that is not yet resolved into language. They looked up when the four bikes stopped. Conversations paused. Colt dismounted and pulled off his riding gloves. He was 6 feet 3 inches, and he walked toward the diner the way a man walks when what comes next has already been decided, and he is simply arriving at it. The crowd moved without being asked. Inside, the tables had been pushed back somewhat, and a few chairs were overturned, and the floor near the corner booth was still wet where the coffee had gone. Agatha Whitfield was still in her corner seat with a cold cup in front of her. Her hands folded, her posture, the composure of someone who had done what needed doing and was waiting for whatever came after that. Wendell came from behind the counter. They had known each other for 20 years and were past formality. "Tell me everything," Colt said. Wendell told him. He told him about Tanner and his crew walking in the particular quality of the morning's cruelty, the coffee in the hands and the plastic container, and what came out of it. He told him about the 40 people who watched and the silence that was its own form of participation. He told him about his own voice when he said, "Get out," and the way it had sounded to him, empty of force, and how he had understood in that moment that he had known for a long time that this was the nature of things in Silver Ridge, and had told himself, as people tell themselves things that allow them to continue, that it was not quite as bad as it appeared. He stopped talking. The diner was quiet. Colt stood in the middle of it, looking at the wet floor, and the pushed-back chairs, and the cold clarity that had settled into his chest somewhere on Highway 50 found its precise edge. He said, "Anyone get video?" Agatha Whitfield said yes. She said she had been frightened, but she had understood that frightened was not the same as helpless, and that documentation was the difference between truth and assertion. She said she had sent it to every device on her airdrop list before she called 911. She gave him her number. 30 seconds later, his phone carried the file. He opened it and watched it through, standing in the diner with Wendell and Chains and Bishop watching him, and when it was finished, he pocketed the phone. His face had not changed, his eyes pale blue and specific as a winter morning had. He said to Chains, "Go get my mother. Bring her home when they release her. Stay with her until I tell you different." Chains said, "Got it, boss." He turned to Wendell. "Where do they go?" Wendell wrote on the back of a napkin without hesitation. "Rusty's Tavern, Highway 50, 10 miles east. Most days they're there by noon." Colt took the napkin. He asked if there were other people Tanner and his crew had hurt. He asked it the way you ask a question when you already understand the answer will be larger than the question suggests. Wendell's face changed in the particular way of a man who has been waiting to be asked this and is not certain whether the asking is a relief or a further wait. "More than I can count," he said. "Dutch Garber's shop 3 weeks ago. Ren Tillman's laundromat before that. Those are the ones I know. There are others. There are always others when nobody's stopping it." And Colfax. Wendell said Colfax writes reports that go nowhere. He said it with the flat precision of someone describing a law of physics. Colt nodded slowly. He looked at Agatha. He said, "The documentation you mentioned. The things you've been keeping track of." She met his eyes with the directness of someone who had been doing something difficult for a long time alone and was no longer interested in understating it. She said, 3 years, 2 full boxes. I can have copies ready by this evening." He said, "I'll come to you tonight." He stood for a moment in the diner in the particular quiet of a room that has witnessed something and has not yet finished processing it, and he thought about his father. About Fletcher Maddox watching this town from wherever the dead watched, if they watched at all, and about what 30 years of watching might have accumulated. He thought about Harold Farrell Sr., who had stood on a piece of ground in 1956 with Fletcher and believed they were building something. He thought about Harold's son, who kept something of that history on his desk each day and used it as decor while he dismantled what it had represented. He had not yet seen the pin. He would see it tomorrow on Farrell's desk, and it would be the moment when this stopped being only about his mother and became also about everything his father had tried to protect and everything that protection had cost. But that was tomorrow. Today he walked out of Crestline Diner and stood on the sidewalk in the October light, with Bishop and Diesel waiting by the bikes, and the sun was high, and the desert was doing what the Nevada desert did in October, which was to make the air taste like something clean and cold just entering the world. His phone rang. Unknown number. A woman's voice, professional and direct. "Mr. Maddox, my name is Darla Westbrook. I work for the federal government. I believe you've been asking questions about what happened this morning." He said, "I'm listening." She said, "So are we. We have been for some time." A pause. He said, "Where can we meet?" He pocketed the phone and looked down Main Street at the town his father had believed in. The storefronts, some occupied and some not, the buildings that had stood since before either of them was born, and some that had changed hands in ways that would make sense. He was beginning to understand when he had seen what Agatha Whitfield had spent 3 years writing down. Chains was already inside helping Dot up from her chair, and they would be heading to the hospital. And later Chains would sit in a hospital hallway for hours because that was what he did. And later still, Dot would look through a narrow window and see her son standing there not moving. And she would understand what that stillness meant because she had known his face for 58 years. But that was later. Now Colt Maddox mounted his Road King and settled into the seat he had put 60,000 miles on and pushed the starter. The engine caught and fired and found its voice, that deep, distinctive sound that was part mechanics and part something harder to categorize, something closer to the sound of a decision being honored. Bishop and Diesel fell in behind him. They rolled east on Highway 50 toward a bar called Rusty's, where 4 young men were in the middle of believing that the morning had gone exactly as planned and that nothing remained but the pleasant afternoon. They were wrong about that. And the thing they were most wrong about, the thing that had never once been a variable in their understanding of how the world worked, was simple. Fletcher Maddox had left Silver Ridge to his son, and his son had come home to collect. The desert spread out around them as they rode, vast and indifferent and beautiful in the way that only hard country could be beautiful. And the mountains rose in the distance with the permanence of things that have outlasted everything that tried to matter and will outlast everything yet to come. And the road ran straight and true toward whatever waited at the end of it. Some debts do not disappear just because you ride away from them. And some roads, no matter how long you take, only ever lead you back to the place you were always supposed to return to. Rusty's Tavern sat 10 miles east of Silver Ridge, like something the desert had been meaning to reclaim for years, but kept getting distracted from. The building was low and cinder block gray, its parking lot gravel and ruts, its neon sign dark in the midday sun, because half the letters had burned out sometime during the previous administration and no one had gotten around to caring since. 6 vehicles in the lot. One of them was a lifted Ford F-250 with custom rims and vanity plates that read CNTMYOR. Subtle, Colt thought. Real subtle. He pulled in and parked facing the entrance, Bishop and Diesel forming up on either side. They killed their engines. The silence that followed was the particular silence of 3 men who have arrived somewhere and are taking a moment to understand it before they move. Colt dismounted. He pulled off his gloves and tucked them in his belt. He checked nothing, adjusted, nothing performed, none of the small preparatory gestures that men sometimes perform when they are working themselves towards something. He simply walked toward the door. Bishop and Diesel followed 2 steps behind the way they always followed when Colt was the one doing the talking. Country music drifted out through the propped open door, something about a long road and a woman left behind. The interior was what the exterior had promised: pool table, jukebox, neon beer signs, doing most of the illumination. The smell of old tobacco pressed into the walls over so many years it had become structural. The bartender, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and the posture of someone who had seen most things and stopped being surprised by them, looked up when they walked in and then looked away in the deliberate manner of a professional who understands when something is not her business. Tanner Farrell was at the pool table. He had his back to the door, lining up a shot, laughing at something Derek Voss had said. Kyle Sutton was on his second beer at the bar. Marcus Doyle was playing something on his phone, feet up on a chair. They were loose and comfortable 4 men who had done what they came to do that morning and were now simply filling the afternoon with the ease of people who did not expect consequences. Colt walked straight to the pool table. His boots made a sound on the scarred wooden floor that the country music did not quite cover. Conversations at the 2 other occupied tables stopped. Tanner felt the shadow before he heard the footsteps. He turned, annoyance already on his face, and then recognition came slowly. The way recognition comes when someone appears somewhere you did not expect them, and your brain takes a moment to catch up. The annoyance did not leave. It had company, though. Something else moved behind Tanner Farrell's eyes, something that looked briefly like the first honest emotion he had expressed all day. He said, "Who the hell are you?" Colt stopped 3 feet from him, close enough to be unmistakable, not so close as to be theatrical. He said, "I'm the son of the woman you hurt this morning." The bar had gone very quiet. Tanner straightened up from his shot and held the pool cue in both hands, not as a weapon, just as something to do with them. He looked Colt over with a particular assessment of a young man who has never genuinely needed to assess anyone and is therefore not very good at it. He took in the vest, the patches, the size. He took in Bishop and Diesel standing just inside the door. Recognition became something more specific. He said, "I know who you are. You're that biker. Ironside, Grandma Maddox's boy." Colt said, "I'm the son of the woman you assaulted." His voice had the even uninflected quality of someone reading the terms of a contract. "You put a venomous animal inside a 76-year-old woman's ear canal while your friend held her in place and another one recorded it. That's assault. That's battery. That's elder abuse, which under Nevada statute carries enhanced penalties. Given the planning involved, a federal prosecutor could argue premeditation." Tanner stared at him. Then he looked at Derek and at Kyle and at Marcus. And the look was the look of someone checking to make sure his audience is witnessing the fact that he is not afraid, which is a different thing from not being afraid. He said, "You want to call that a crime, you go ahead. I call it a slow Tuesday." Colt reached into his vest pocket and took out his phone. He called up the video Agatha had sent him and held it up so Tanner could see the screen. He watched Tanner's face as the younger man watched himself. He watched the slight shift in color, the particular stillness that came over someone seeing something they had done from the outside for the first time. He said, "This is clear video evidence. Your face, your friends' faces. The full sequence, beginning to end. Taken in a public space by a private citizen, which means it is legally obtained and admissible." He put the phone away. "So here is what is going to happen. You are going to come with me to your father's office. You are going to tell him what you did. You are going to apologize to my mother in person. You are going to pay her medical bills, and you are going to turn yourself in to Sheriff Colfax, or if you prefer, directly to the federal agents who are currently operating in Silver Ridge." The last part landed differently than the rest. He had intended it to. Tanner processed it. Then he laughed the way people laugh when they are genuinely surprised by the audacity of something. "Do you know who my father is?" Colt said, "I know exactly who your father is." "Then you know that video doesn't matter. My father runs this county. Sheriff Colfax works for him, the judges work for him. Half the state legislature has attended his fundraisers. You think some cell phone footage is going to change any of that?" "I think the truth matters," Colt said. Tanner stepped forward. He moved the pool cue to one hand and pointed with the other, the gesture of someone making a point they find very important. "The truth," he said, "is what my father says it is. And my father is going to say that some confused old woman put that bug in her own ear for the attention and can't remember what actually happened." He looked at Colt with something approaching curiosity. "Is that really why you came here? Because you honestly think this changes anything?" Colt said, "Last chance, Tanner. Come with me now and do the right thing, or this video goes everywhere. Every news station, every social media platform, every contact I have accumulated over 30 years of being exactly the kind of person your father would prefer did not exist." Tanner said, "Get out of my bar before I call the sheriff and have you arrested for harassment." Colt nodded slowly. He turned to leave. He had taken 2 steps when Derek Voss moved. It was not graceful. It was the movement of someone who had been drinking since morning and whose judgment had arrived at the place where it felt like courage. He stepped out from the bar rail, and there was a Glock 19 in his hand, and his arm was extended in the approximate direction of Colt's center mass, and his finger was on the trigger in the way that told Bishop Waverly everything he needed to know about Derek Voss's firearms training, which was that there had been essentially none of it. "Don't move," Derek said. His voice had the slightly elevated pitch of genuine adrenaline. "All of you back against the wall." The bar went completely still. Even the jukebox seemed to sense it, one song ending, in the silence another not beginning. Colt did not move. His hands were at his sides. He said, "Put the gun down, son. Nobody needs to get hurt." "Shut up," Derek said. "Just shut up." His hand was shaking. Not badly, but enough. Bishop Waverly had served in the Gulf War. He had been in situations where men with weapons were making decisions that affected everyone in the immediate vicinity, and he had developed over the course of those situations a very precise understanding of the difference between someone who would fire and someone who was hoping very hard they would not have to. He had also developed the particular physical efficiency of someone who had learned at considerable personal cost that hesitation was its own form of decision. He moved, not dramatically, not the way it looked in films, Just one fluid redirection of weight and one hand closing over the Glock's slide and racking it back hard, ejecting the chambered round, and the other hand finding the magazine release. The magazine clattered to the floor. The slide came off the frame in the same motion. 2 seconds, the gun reduced to its components in Derek Voss's hands. Bishop took the pieces and handed them back one at a time. Frame, slide, magazine, the ejected round last rolling across his palm. He said safety was off. You'd have hit the ceiling or yourself or someone who didn't deserve it. He said it without heat, the way you say something that is simply true. Learn to handle a weapon before you point it at a man, and keep your finger outside the guard until you have made a decision you are prepared to live with. Derek Voss stood holding the disassembled pieces of his gun, his face the color of old chalk. Colt looked back at Tanner, who had not moved, and whose expression had passed through several variations in the last 10 seconds and landed on something that combined rage and humiliation in equal parts. Colt said, "This is your last warning. Do the right thing, because the next time I come back, I will not be this polite." They walked out. The desert light hit them full in the face. Behind them through the open door, they could already hear Tanner on his phone, his voice tight and urgent, calling someone. Colt had expected that. He was in fact counting on it. The hospital room was on the second floor corner end of the east wing with a window that looked out over the parking lot, and beyond that, the long, flat reach of the Nevada desert going all the way to the mountains. In the mid-afternoon, the light came through at an angle that made the room feel warmer than it was. Dot Maddox was sitting up when Colt came back. The bandage on her ear had been changed fresh white gauze, and the swelling around her jaw had deepened in color, but the pain medication had taken the worst of the edge off, and she was, to a careful observer, more herself than she had been that morning. She had asked a nurse for her lipstick. She had put it on before Colt arrived, Coral, because she was 76 years old, and she would be damned if she was going to lie in a hospital bed looking like she had given up. She watched him pull a chair to her bedside and sit in it. He sat with his forearms on his knees, his hands loose, looking at her with an expression she recognized from when he was a boy, that particular careful attention that meant he was taking something seriously. She said, "How did it go?" He said, "About as expected." She said, "Did you hurt anyone?" He said, "No." She said, "Good." Then she said, "Colt, I need you to understand something. Whatever you're planning, whatever comes next, I need you to do it the right way. Not because I'm asking you to protect yourself, because your father would be watching." He said, "I know, Mom." She said, "Fletcher used to say that the road will take you where you need to go if you let it." He didn't mean Highway 50. He meant the choices, the ones you make when it would be easier to make a different one. Colt looked at his hands for a moment. He said, "I found out something today about Sheriff Colfax." She waited. He told her. He told her about the duty log and Route 9 and the timestamps that did not lie. He told her quietly and without emphasis, the way you tell someone something that you have already processed past the point of needing a reaction from it. She was quiet for a long time after. Then she said, "He was always Farrell's man." I don't think anyone who paid attention was surprised. She looked at the window, but knowing it and knowing it are different things, aren't they? He said they were. He stayed another hour. When he left, Chains was settled into a chair in the hallway with a cup of coffee and the particular patient immobility of someone who intends to be in that chair for as long as necessary. Colt touched his shoulder as he passed a brief acknowledgement. Chains nodded without looking up. Outside, Bishop was waiting by the bikes. Colt stood in the hospital parking lot in the October afternoon and looked at the sky, that particular Nevada blue that felt like it went all the way through the atmosphere to space, and he thought about everything he knew and everything he did not yet know, and he thought about what came next. What came next was Walt Garber. Dutch's welding shop sat on the south edge of town. Its corrugated blue walls faded to the color of old denim. The sign above the door said Walt Garber Welding, established 1979, and the paint on the letters was due for attention, but the steel beneath was solid. The shop had been in some form of operation for 45 years, which meant Dutch had been welding before most of Silver Ridge's current residents had started school. He answered the side door on the second knock, and his face when he saw Colt did what faces do when they see someone they have been expecting and hoping not to need. He said, "Garrett, Colt, I heard about your mother. I'm sorry." Colt said, "Tell me what they did to your shop." Dutch stepped back from the door and let them in. The interior smelled of metal and cutting fluid, and the particular scorched clean scent of recent arc welding. The shop was organized in the way of someone who worked alone and knew where everything was, which meant it was ordered by a logic that might not be immediately apparent to an outside observer, but was absolute to the person who lived inside it. One wall was pegboard tools hung in the precise outlines of their shapes. The workbenches held projects in various stages. 3 weeks ago, Dutch said, leading them to the back. Monday morning, I came in and found it. The photographs were in a manila folder in his desk drawer. He handed them to Colt without preamble. Colt went through them slowly. Spray paint on the walls, words he would not repeat to Dot. Tools knocked from pegboards and scattered across the floor. The welding tanks in the corner, not ruptured but dented. Someone had taken something heavy to them with enough force to cost Dutch $2,000 in replacements and a week of insurance paperwork. The photographs documented everything with the exhausted thoroughness of a man who knew he would need to show these to someone eventually and was not certain that day would come. Colt said Colfax came out. Dutch said yes. Took photos. Said he would investigate. Colt said nothing happened. Dutch said I called back 2 weeks later. He said there was insufficient evidence to pursue charges. Said it was probably kids. Dutch's voice had the flat, careful quality of someone describing a wound they have had time to clean and bandage, but not to heal. I knew who it was. My security camera caught them. The angle isn't perfect. They had their hoods up. But one of them had his sleeve rolled, and you can see the tattoo on the inner wrist. He retrieved a second folder from the cabinet, handed it over. Colt looked at the still images. 4 figures in hoodies, faces partially obscured, but the body language unmistakable. Tanner Farrell moved a certain way. You learn that about people if you watch them long enough. And there on the inner wrist of the one closest to the camera, a geometric tattoo, some kind of angular pattern, dark ink clearly visible. He showed it to Colfax, Dutch said. Colfax looked at it for about 5 seconds and said it wasn't conclusive. Said lots of people had tattoos. Said he'd need more evidence to seek a warrant. He was covering for them, Colt said. Dutch looked at him directly. He said, I know that. Everyone in this town knows that. Knowing it and doing something about it are 2 different propositions. When the man you'd be doing something about is connected to the man who runs the county. Colt asked if Dutch would testify to all of this. Dutch did not hesitate. He said yes. He said he had done 22 years in the Navy, had come home and built this shop from a leased space and a second-hand welder, and he had served his country and his community in every way he knew how, and he was not going to be afraid in his own shop because some entitled young man knew his father would protect him. He said, your father was a good man, Colt. One of the best I knew. I owe him more than I've probably admitted out loud. Whatever I can do to help, I'll do it. Colt shook his hand. He told Dutch to call him immediately if anyone came near the shop. He told him not to try to handle it himself. Dutch said he had handled harder things. Colt said he knew, but he shouldn't have to. Ren Tillman's laundromat. Laundromat occupied a narrow storefront between a thrift shop and a building that had once been an insurance office and was now a careful arrangement of plywood and old ambition. The laundromat was open and running machines, going the smell of warm fabric and detergent in the air, and Ren herself was behind the counter, going through invoices with the focus of someone who was using paperwork to avoid thinking about something else. She looked up when Colt walked in. She was 52, compact and direct, with the posture of someone who had been carrying everything alone for long enough that it no longer registered as a burden. No ring on her left hand. The kind of careful, assessing look she gave him was the look of a woman who had been let down enough times to take nothing at face value. He told her who he was. She said she knew. She said she was sorry about Dot. He asked her about her windows. She set down her pen. 6 weeks ago, she said, I came in on a Thursday morning and both front windows were gone. Just gone. Glass all over the sidewalk. The graffiti was on the inside wall, which meant they'd come through the windows, not just broken them from outside. Half the coin machines were damaged. The coins stolen. $5,000 in damage, not counting the week I was closed for repairs, and I operate on margins that don't absorb a week of closure easily. She showed him the repair invoices. She showed him the photographs she had taken before the cleanup, the same exhausted documentation instinct as Dutch, the understanding that you would need to show someone eventually and might as well be ready. They were in here the week before, she said. Tanner and his friends. They came in drunk, not as bad as today, but bad enough, moving around, touching things, making comments. I asked them to leave. She paused. Tanner looked at me the way people look at you when they want you to understand something without saying it. He said I'd regret being unfriendly, Colt said, and 3 days later. She nodded. And when I called Colfax, he came out, wrote it all down very carefully, called me back a week later to say there was no evidence sufficient for charges and suggested I install security cameras. She gestured around the laundromat with an openness that made the gesture almost funny. I have 6 machines running constantly just to keep the lights on. Security cameras. She would testify. She said it the same way Dutch had said it, without hesitation, as though she had been waiting to be asked. She said she was scared that she knew what Tanner and his father were capable of, and that fear was a rational response to it, but she was also done being scared in a way that served them. She said for Dot, and for everyone else who never got asked. He told her she would not be doing it alone. He told her he would have people outside her shop and her home from tonight until this was finished. He told her if anything changed, anything at all, she called him first. She walked them to the door. As they left, she said, "Your mother used to come in here, bring her laundry on slow mornings, and we'd talk while it ran. She told me once that her son had his father's hands and his father's head, and she just hoped he'd eventually get his father's heart back in the right place." She said it without unkindness. He carried it with him out onto the sidewalk. Agatha Whitfield's living room was a room that told you everything you needed to know about the person who lived in it without requiring Agatha to say a word. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves on 2 walls, a desk in the corner that held a laptop, a printer, and an inbox with actual paper in it. On the coffee table, 2 bankers' boxes side by side, their lids off their contents ordered with the meticulous care of someone who taught English and history for 37 years and understood that documentation was the difference between truth and assertion. She had made tea. She did not ask if they wanted any. She poured 3 cups and put them on the table beside the boxes and sat across from Colt with the bearing of a woman who has been waiting for this conversation for some time and intends to make it count. She said, "I have been putting this together for 3 years. Since I realized that what was happening to this town was not a series of unconnected events." Colt said, "Tell me." She told him. Crestline Properties, LC Delaware registration ownership, hidden behind 3 layers of shell company structure, standard practice for people who want to move money without their name appearing on documents. 17 properties acquired in Elko and Lander counties over 8 years. She had the addresses, the purchase prices, the dates. She had the comparative market analyses she had run herself with assistance from a real estate attorney friend in Carson City who owed her a favor. The properties were bought at prices ranging from 20 to 40% below market value from owners who had, in every single case, experienced some form of regulatory or financial pressure in the months immediately preceding the sale. Permit problems that materialized without precedent. Health code violations that appeared in businesses that had operated without incident for decades. Tax reassessments that made no mathematical sense. The pattern was not subtle if you were looking for it. The difficulty was that you had to be looking. She reached into the first box and produced a set of corporate documents. Initial articles of incorporation for Crestline Properties filed in 2016. She turned to the page she had bookmarked with a yellow strip. "Initial board of directors," she said. "Look at the names." Colt looked. Clifton Farrell, Roy Colfax, Tanner Farrell listed as treasurer, 24 years old at the time of filing. He read it twice. 8 years, Agatha said. "They have been doing this for 8 years, and every person who tried to resist lost their business or gave up or moved away, or in one case did not move anywhere at all." He looked up from the documents. She reached into the second box. "Calvin Mercer Jr.," she said. He owned 30 acres on the west side of the county family land going back 2 generations. Crestline wanted it for a development project that would have tripled their profit on the adjacent parcels they already owned. Calvin said no. He organized community opposition, filed complaints with the county planning board, threatened legal action. She produced a printed email. She held it for a moment before she handed it to him. "The way you hold something you have been carrying for a long time and are finally putting down." "He sent me this," she said, 1 week before he died. Colt read it. The email was 6 years old. The message was 8 sentences. Calvin Mercer Jr. had written that he was frightened, that someone had come to his house and told him he was making things difficult, that he was documenting everything and leaving copies with his attorney, and that if something happened to him, Agatha should know who had been to his house and what they had said. "The fire marshal ruled the fire accidental," Agatha said. "Calvin was inside. The house was a total loss." Colt was quiet. He said the person who came to his house. She said he didn't name them in the email. But 3 weeks after the fire, a new deputy joined Colfax's department, a man named Warren Hicks. She pulled a photograph from the box, a grainy image pulled from an old county employee directory. "I asked my attorney friend to run his background 6 months ago." She paused. "The Social Security number on his county application belongs to a man who died in 2003 in Flagstaff, Arizona. Warren Hicks doesn't exist. Whoever is wearing that name has been hiding in plain sight with a badge for 6 years." Colt set the email down on the coffee table with the care you use with something fragile. He said, "Who else knows about this?" She said, "Until today, just me." He took both boxes. He told her he needed copies of everything. She pointed to the second set of boxes behind her chair, identical to the first already prepared. He said, "This is thorough work. Better than thorough." She said someone had to keep track. "I taught history for 37 years. I understand what happens when things go undocumented." She looked at him steadily. "I just needed someone who cared enough to use it." He picked up both boxes and carried them to the door. He stepped outside into the late afternoon, and the weight of what he was holding was not just the physical weight of paper and files. It was the weight of 8 years of careful witnessing by a retired schoolteacher who had not given up when everyone else found it easier to look away. He stood on Agatha's porch for a moment. He thought about his father. He thought about Fletcher Maddox watching this town from whatever vantage point the dead had, if they had any, and what that watching might have looked like for the last 8 years. He thought about 30 years on the road, 30 years of motion. He put the boxes in his saddlebag and went to find Harlan Crane. Harlan Crane had been a federal prosecutor for 14 years before he left the U.S. Attorney's Office and opened a private practice in Reno that specialized in exactly the kind of case that made other defense attorneys nervous to sit across from. He drove a gunmetal Mercedes that he parked without apology in the Iron Covenant's gravel lot when he arrived at 7 that evening, and he stepped out wearing a suit that cost more than most bikes in the row and carried a briefcase with the practiced ease of someone who used it as a tool rather than an accessory. He and Colt shook hands the way men shake hands when they have history and trust and do not need to perform either. Colt said, "Thank you for coming. Crane said you told me if you ever needed help to call." He looked at the documentation spread across the meeting room table, the boxes from Agatha, the photos from Dutch, the repair invoices from Wren, the video, the phone records Colt had already requested through channels. He said, "What am I looking at?" Colt told him. Crane listened the way good lawyers listen, which is completely and without the impulse to begin formulating responses before the other person has finished. When Colt was done, Crane sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. He said, "You know, I can't do this alone." Colt said, "Agent Darla Westbrook, FBI Regional. She's been in Silver Ridge for 3 weeks. She called me this afternoon." Crane looked at him. He said, "The DEA work. Your old file. She knows." Colt said, "She knows enough." Crane said, "If we go at this the right way, we go at it completely. No halfway. Federal and state both. RICO statute plus the individual criminal counts." He looked at the corporate filings, the Crestline Board of Directors list. When he saw the names, he was quiet for a moment. Farrell Colfax and his own son as treasurer. He said they weren't even careful. Colt said they didn't think they needed to be. Crane said people who believe they are untouchable rarely do. He closed the folder. "Get me formal statements from the witnesses. On record, documented, notarized. Get me everything Westbrook has from the electronic surveillance. And give me 24 hours to drive back to Reno and coordinate with her office." He picked up the folder with the Calvin Mercer email. He read it once, then he set it down and looked at Colt with something that was not quite pity and not quite admiration, but contained elements of both. He said, "The Mercer situation. If what this Whitfield woman has documented is accurate, and if Warren Hicks is who I think he might be, this stops being a corruption case." Colt said, "I know." Crane said, "You understand what this means for the scope of the investigation, what it means for how it has to be handled." He said it carefully, the way lawyers say things when the stakes have just changed in a way that requires precision. Colt said, "I understand completely. Do it the right way." They shook hands again. Crane left. His Mercedes made almost no sound going down the gravel drive. The call came at 9:47 in the evening. Colt was in the clubhouse kitchen with a cup of coffee. He had not been drinking when his phone lit up with a number he recognized immediately because he had been given it that afternoon by the caller himself. "Prescott Lund, Mayor Farrell's attorney." He answered. Lund's voice was the voice of someone who considered his time extremely valuable and wanted you to be aware of this even in the opening pleasantries. He said that Mayor Farrell had asked him to reach out on behalf of the Farrell family and that he hoped they could resolve the present situation in a manner that was advantageous to all parties. Colt said, "I'm listening." Lund said that the mayor was deeply concerned about the incident that morning. He said that Tanner suffered from substance dependency issues that the family had been quietly addressing and that they had secured a treatment placement effective immediately. He said that the family was prepared to cover Dorothy Maddox's medical expenses in full, along with a settlement that he believed would be considered generous. He said that in exchange, the family would ask only that no public statements were made, no legal action was pursued, and the matter was resolved privately in a way that preserved everyone's dignity. He said the word dignity the way people say it when they mean convenience. Colt said, "Tell the mayor no." Lund said he understood that Colt might want time to consider the offer, and that it was perhaps worth noting that the mayor had considerable resources, and that making an enemy of him would be a decision with consequences that Colt might find difficult to manage. Colt said, "Tell him no." Lund said he was sorry to hear that. He said there was one additional matter the mayor had asked him to raise. He said it delicately. He said that over the years, Mayor Farrell had accumulated certain documentation pertaining to Colt's prior activities conducted under a federal identity that was not his own activities that the biker community might view with a particular unfavorable perspective if they were to become public. He did not say the word DEA. He did not need to. Colt was quiet for 4 seconds. He felt something in his chest that was not quite fear and was not quite surprise, a cold recognition that this particular card had always existed and had always been a possibility, and that the only meaningful question was what he was going to do now that it had been played. He said, "Tell Mayor Farrell that I said no. Tell him that what he does with that information is his decision, and he will live with the consequences of it either way. Tell him I am done being threatened by small men who mistake their own impunity for power." He ended the call. He set the phone down on the kitchen counter and stood there in the quiet of the clubhouse. And the thing that moved through him was not anger, which was what he might have expected. It was something more like clarity, the kind that arrives when you have been carrying a weight for a very long time and finally set it down, not because someone told you to, but because you chose to. The phone rang again 40 minutes later. Different number, he recognized it. Roy Colfax. He answered. Colfax's voice had the tight, careful quality of someone who was trying to sound reasonable and knew they were not. He said he was calling as a courtesy. He said he knew what Colt was planning, and he needed Colt to understand that Farrell had connections that went higher than a county sheriff's office, that there were state-level relationships that could make what Colt was trying to do extremely difficult. He said Colt was a smart man and smart men knew when to walk away. Colt said, "Do your job, Roy. Arrest Tanner Farrell. Investigate Crestline Properties. Be the sheriff this county needs." Colfax said it was not that simple. Colt said, "Yes, it is. You just choose comfort over courage. Every day you make that choice." He ended the call. He sat down at the kitchen table and looked at his hands. They were the hands of a man who had rebuilt hundreds of engines, who had ridden more miles than he had ever counted, who had spent years living as someone else in the service of the government that Colfax was now invoking as a reason to do nothing. He thought about his father's hands in the old photographs, always occupied, always in the middle of making something. He got up and walked to his mother's bedroom. He was not sure why he went there. Some instinct, some pull towards something he could not have named. The room was small and orderly, the kind of order that came from a lifetime of knowing exactly where everything was and keeping it there. The lamp with the lantern base that he had given her 3 Christmases ago was on the nightstand. The silver frame with Fletcher's photograph was on the dresser. He stood in the doorway for a moment, not turning on the light, letting his eyes adjust. He went to the closet. He was looking for an extra blanket. He found it on the shelf. And beside it, in a shoebox that Dot had never mentioned, a collection of things she had kept and not talked about. He almost put it back. He almost left it alone. He opened it. Letters mostly. A few photographs. The kind of things a person keeps, not as a memorial, but as a preservation, the specific artifacts of a life that mattered. At the bottom of the box, folded twice and never mailed, was a letter in Fletcher Maddox's handwriting. The date at the top was 1989. The envelope was addressed to Harold Farrell Sr. He stood in the dark of his mother's bedroom and read it. Fletcher had written to his old friend with the particular careful honesty of someone who has thought a long time about whether to say something and has decided the saying matters more than the comfort of silence. He wrote that he was worried about Clifton. He wrote that ambition was not in itself a flaw, that he had admired Harold's drive from the day they had met coming home from Korea with their whole lives ahead of them, in a country that felt, despite everything, like it was worth building something in. He wrote that Clifton had Harold's ambition and his intelligence, but seemed to be missing something else, something harder to name, something that had to do with the difference between wanting things and earning them. He wrote that ambition without conscience was just greed in a better suit. He wrote that he hoped Harold would talk to his son before it became something neither of them could fix. He wrote that he was saying this as a friend, as the man who had stood next to Harold Farrell on the day they broke ground on the Silver Ridge Community Center in 1956, both of them 23 years old, and full of something he could only describe as genuine belief in the place they were trying to build. He had never sent it. Colt stood in the dark and held the letter and thought about a man who could see a thing clearly enough to write it down and still not find the way to say it. He thought about 30 years of writing away. He thought about the pin on Clifton Farrell's desk, the Iron Covenant pin his father had cast in 1958 and given to Harold Farrell Sr. as a symbol of something real, and the fact that Clifton had kept it on his desk while he systematically dismantled everything those two men had tried to build together. He folded the letter carefully and put it back exactly where he had found it. He walked back to the kitchen and called Bishop. He said, "Get everyone together, full chapter meeting. Tonight, anyone who can't make it in person is on the phone, everyone." By 10:30, the Iron Covenant's meeting room held 21 men. Members from the home chapter and 2 visiting chapters who had come in over the previous hours as word moved through the Brotherhood the way word moved through it by phone and by road without announcement, but with the particular urgency that meant something real was happening. The room smelled of leather and motor oil and the quiet solidity of men who had chosen each other. Colt stood at the head of the table. He did not begin with what they were going to do. He began with what he had done. He told them about the DEA work, the years undercover with the Scorpions case, the sealed file, the identity he had operated under. He told them the way you tell something when you are no longer going to carry it alone, when the carrying has become the wrong choice, and you have finally recognized it as such. The room was quiet when he finished. Bishop said, "How long have you known Farrell had that file?" Colt said, "I suspected for about 3 years. I confirmed it tonight." Dutch, who had come in from across town with no one asking him and no one surprised, said from his chair near the window, "It doesn't change what I know about you, Colt, or what your father was." Bishop said, "You stood up for your mother. That's the only thing that matters to me about today." Chains said, "I'm in, same as I was when I walked out of that garage this morning." Around the table, one by one, each man spoke. Some of them had never met Dot Maddox. Some of them had never been to Silver Ridge. That was not the point. The point was what they were and what they chose to be when it counted, and that had been decided long before tonight. Colt looked at their faces. He thought about Fletcher's letter, about a man who believed in this place and in the people who chose to stand for something in it. He said, "Here's what happens tomorrow. Harlan Crane arrives at 8 in the morning. Federal agents execute warrants simultaneously at Farrell's office, his home Crestline Properties headquarters, and Sheriff Colfax's office. Every file, every computer, every financial record comes out. We stay clear of the execution. We protect the witnesses. We document everything that happens near us." He paused. He said, "And when it is over, we make sure the people of this town know they are not alone, that someone stood when it mattered." A man near the back said, "What about the Scorpions?" Colt had not told them the second part of Lund's information, the part about Farrell's arrangement with Scorpion, Ridge Riders, the promise of Iron Covenant land in exchange for neutralizing Colt. He told them now. He told them flatly and without theater. The room's quality of silence changed. Chains said, "They're making a move on our land." Colt said, "They think they are." He said it with the particular steadiness of someone who has already worked out what that means and what to do about it. Farrell promised them something he doesn't own and can't deliver because he is not going to be in any position to deliver anything after tomorrow morning. The Scorpions move if they think we're weak. We make sure they understand we are not. He looked at Diesel. He said, "Reach out tonight. Not a threat, just clarity. Let them know that whatever conversation they were having with Farrell's people is a conversation that no longer applies." Diesel nodded. Colt said, "The rest of you. Security details tonight, rotating shifts. Dutch's shop, Ren Tillman's laundromat, Agatha Whitfield's house, my mother's room. Nobody approaches those locations without our knowledge." He looked at the table. At 21 men who had chosen this room and this life, and this particular way of being accountable to each other. He said, "My father built this brotherhood on one principle. A man stands for those who cannot stand for themselves. Tonight his brothers are my brothers." No one said anything for a moment. Then Chain said, "What time do we ride in the morning?" Colt said, "Be ready at 5:30. The meeting ended. Men dispersed to their positions, pulling on gloves and jackets, mounting their bikes in the dark lot, and rolling out toward the various points they were responsible for through the night. The sound of engines starting and fading was the sound of something purposeful moving in the darkness of the Nevada desert. Colt stayed at the table after the others had gone. He sat with his coffee in the quiet of the empty room and the particular feeling of a man who has been moving towards something for a very long time and can see it now close enough to feel the gravity of it. His phone lit up on the table. Unknown number. He answered it. The voice was familiar, not from recent memory, from the older kind, the kind you carry in the body rather than the mind, the kind attached to a place and a history and a version of yourself you thought you had left behind. Clifton Farrell said, "Last chance, Ironside. Walk away from this. I'm offering you a way out that won't cost everyone everything." Colt said nothing for a moment. He let the silence sit between them. He thought about a letter that was never sent, about a pin cast in 1958 sitting on a desk 30 feet from where Clifton Farrell slept, about 2 men with shovels in 1956 standing on ground they were going to build something on. He said, "See you in court, Clifton." Farrell was quiet for 2 seconds. Then he said quietly in a voice that Colt had not expected, "You sound just like Fletcher." Colt said nothing. The call ended. He sat in the empty meeting room of the Iron Covenant Riders Silver Ridge chapter, and outside the windows the Nevada night was deep and cold and full of stars. And somewhere down the road his mother was sleeping in a hospital bed with a bandage on her ear and chains in the hallway. And somewhere across town, Clifton Farrell was sitting with whatever version of himself he had chosen to be. Over 62 years, and somewhere in a filing cabinet in Reno, Harlan Crane was already building the architecture of what came next. Colt Maddox set his coffee down and looked at his father's photograph on the wall. He said, "I know, Dad, I know." Then he put on his jacket, went outside, and stood in the dark with his hand on the tank of his Road King for a long moment, feeling the cold metal under his palms solid and real. 5:30 came early in Nevada in October. He went inside to sleep. The alarm on Colt Maddox's phone went off at 4:55 in the morning, but he was already awake. He had slept 3 hours in the spare room of the Iron Covenant clubhouse, on a cot that had seen better decades under a blanket that smelled of motor oil, and the particular dusty warmth of a room where men had rested between one hard thing and the next. He lay in the dark for a moment after the alarm and listened to the desert. The Nevada night at this hour had a quality of absolute completion to it, as if the world had arrived at some final arrangement and was waiting to see what happened when light returned. He got up, he dressed, he went to the kitchen and made coffee the way his mother had taught him, which was strong enough to hold its own convictions. He stood at the window and drank it and thought about Clifton Farrell. He thought about the last thing Farrell had said before ending the call. The particular quality of those 4 words, the way they had come out of a 62-year-old man's throat, not as an accusation, but as something more complicated, something closer to recognition. "You sound just like Fletcher." He had not meant it as a compliment, and he had not meant it as an insult. He had meant it the way you mean something when you have been carrying a truth for a very long time, and it finally escapes you at a moment you did not choose. Colt put the mug down. He pulled on his vest. He walked outside into the pre-dawn cold and stood with his hand on the tank of his Road King for a moment, the metal cold under his palm grounding him. By 5:30, the chapter was assembled. 14 men in the gravel lot, engines not yet running, voices low. Bishop was on his phone with Agent Westbrook, confirming timing and positions. Chains had come in from the hospital at 4, reporting that Dot had slept through the night and that the day nurse had arrived and everything was quiet. Diesel had reached out to the Scorpion Ridge riders the previous evening, a brief and unambiguous communication that whatever arrangement they believed they had with the Farrell family was a conversation that had ended when Clifton Farrell's ability to deliver anything ended, which would be approximately dawn. The Scorpions had not responded. That was in its way a response. At 5:58, Agent Westbrook texted a single word: "Go." Colt said, "We hold our positions, we document, we stay clear of the execution." He mounted his bike. The others followed. They rode into Silver Ridge as the sky was beginning its first pale argument with the darkness, that particular shade of deep blue that preceded true dawn in the high desert by about 20 minutes, and always looked to Colt like the sky was making a decision. They positioned themselves on Main Street, spread out in pairs, engines off, watching. At 6 o'clock, exactly 4 teams of federal agents moved simultaneously on 4 locations. The mayor's office on County Road was a 2-story stone building that had been built in 1962 and had not changed much since, which was part of how Clifton Farrell liked it. Permanence is a form of authority. 5 agents went through the front entrance with a federal warrant and the particular unhurried efficiency of people who had done this before and understood that speed without precision was wasted motion. Crestline Properties, RDL. LC operated out of a suite in the only office building in Silver Ridge that had been built in this century, a glass and steel construction on the edge of downtown that had always looked slightly out of place, like something that had arrived from somewhere with more money and had not quite adjusted to where it landed. 5 agents. Sheriff Colfax's office in the attached county jail occupied a low brick building on 3rd Street that smelled of old coffee and institutional cleaning fluid, and the particular staleness of a place where paperwork had accumulated for 40 years without anyone sorting through it properly. 5 agents. And the Farrell residence, the house on Ridgeline Drive that sat on 3 acres behind a low stone wall with a circular driveway and a 2-car garage, in the kind of manicured landscaping that announced money not through extravagance, but through the steady expenditure of attention. The team of 5 who approached it found the front porch light on. They found the door unlocked. They found Clifton Farrell in the foyer dressed in a 3-piece suit, standing with his hands at his sides, his briefcase on the floor beside him. He was not on the phone. He was not attempting anything. He was simply standing in his foyer in the early morning, dressed as if for a court appearance, waiting. He had been waiting since 5 o'clock. The lead agent told him they had a federal warrant for his arrest and the search of his premises. She read him his rights in the particular careful cadence of someone for whom this was not a performance, but a procedure. Farrell listened without expression. He said, "I understand." He held out his hands. Colt was standing on the sidewalk across from the Farrell property when the agents led Clifton Farrell out through the front door. The light was coming now, the first real light of the day breaking over the mountains to the east and painting the desert in the early shades of amber that the high Nevada desert did better than anywhere else Colt had ridden. The cameras were already there, two local crews in a van from Reno that had been tipped by someone, probably Westbrook's office, that a significant federal action was taking place. The cameras found Farrell immediately the way cameras always found the person the story was about. Farrell walked down the front path between two agents, and he walked the way he had lived, which was with the bearing of a man who understood that how you move through the world was itself a form of argument. His head was up. His steps were measured. He had chosen in whatever hours he had spent dressing and waiting this morning to go out in a way that retained something. He reached the bottom of the path. He looked across the street. He and Colt were perhaps 40 feet apart in the early morning light, and they looked at each other across the distance and across the 30 years and across everything that had been built and broken in the space between. Farrell's eyes moved to Colt's vest, to the Iron Covenant pin on the left lapel, the one that Colt had found in Agatha's second box of documents, the original cast from 1958, Fletcher Maddox's work, given to Harold Farrell Sr. as a symbol of something real and kept by his son for reasons that only Clifton Farrell could fully explain. Colt had worn it this morning without making a decision about it. It had simply seemed right. Farrell stopped. One of the agents said something to him, a hand at his elbow. Farrell stood for 3 seconds. He looked at the pin. His jaw tightened in a way that was almost imperceptible and would not have read on camera and did not need to. Then he closed his eyes, just for a moment, a single breath, the kind of breath a man takes when something is finished. He opened his eyes, looked at Colt one last time, and then turned away and got into the back of the federal vehicle. The door closed. The vehicle pulled out of the driveway and onto Ridgeline Drive and headed toward the federal building in Reno. Colt watched it go. He did not move for a long time after it had disappeared. Chains came up beside him. He said nothing. He just stood there, which was the right thing to do. The cameras were turning toward Colt now, toward the man in the leather vest standing across from the mayor's house at dawn with the silver pin on his lapel. Someone would ask him for a statement later. He would give one that was brief and contained no triumph, because triumph was not what he felt. What he felt was closer to the particular exhaustion that comes at the end of something that has taken too long to arrive. He said to Chains, "Go get my mother. Bring her home." 2 things happened that morning that Colt did not expect. The first was Warren Hicks. When the team of federal agents arrived at Sheriff Colfax's office at 6 o'clock, they executed their warrant on the building and on Silas Colfax, who was found in his office with a half-eaten breakfast on his desk and the expression of a man who had been waiting for the other shoe to drop for a very long time and was almost relieved it had finally fallen. He did not resist. He barely spoke. He sat in the chair they indicated and let them work around him with the stillness of a man who had used up all his options. But in the filing room, they found something else. Deputy Warren Hicks's desk was cleared. His locker in the adjacent room was empty, cleaned out with a thoroughness that suggested advanced knowledge and preparation. On his desk, held down by his county-issued radio, was a single sheet of paper, a handwritten note. The agent who found it read it, and then read it again, and then photographed it and called Westbrook directly. The note said that he had known since the night had happened that Calvin Mercer Jr. had not been alone in that house. He had been told the house would be empty. He had not verified that himself, and that failure, the failure of not checking, of taking someone's word for something that cost a man his life, was something he had lived with every day for 6 years. He said he was not asking for forgiveness because he understood he had not earned the right to ask for it. He said he was going to Reno to surrender himself to the FBI field office, and that he hoped the Mercer family would someday understand, even if they could not forgive. He had signed it with his real name, not Warren Hicks. His real name was Gary Bolin, formerly of Flagstaff, Arizona, and he had driven to Reno in the middle of the night and walked into the federal building at 4:17 in the morning and told the night duty agent that he needed to speak to whoever was handling the Silver Ridge corruption investigation and that he would wait as long as necessary. He was in an interview room when Westbrook arrived at 6:30. She called Colt at 7. She told him what Bolin had said, what he had confessed to, what he had said about the house and about Calvin Mercer, and about 6 years of carrying something that had made him, as he told the interviewing agent, unable to sleep in any room with a window because windows reminded him of fire. Colt listened. He said what happens to him. Westbrook said that depends on what he gives us and how much of it holds up. He's already said he'll testify against Farrell on the conspiracy to commit arson, which combined with the death of Calvin Mercer makes it felony murder. He'll be looking at 12 years minimum, even with full cooperation. But he came in himself. He didn't wait to be taken. Colt thought about a man who had lived for 6 years with the knowledge of what he had done, about the particular quality of that kind of weight. He was not going to make a judgment about what Gary Bolin deserved or didn't deserve, because he understood that he was not the person to make that judgment and that someone else, someone who had lost more, had a prior claim on it. He thought about the widow of Calvin Mercer. He thought about Eli Mercer, 22 years old, the age Colt had been when he had first started to understand that the world was not organized in a way that automatically delivered justice to the people who needed it. He said to Westbrook, make sure the Mercer family is notified before it's in the news. She said, already being arranged. The second thing that happened that morning was Prescott Lund. At 9:15, as the news coverage was beginning to find its shape across the local stations, and the first wire service reports were moving, an email went out from the offices of Lund & Associates addressed to 11 journalists containing a package of documents. The package was labeled at the top of the cover letter as material in the public interest concerning the criminal history and federal activities of Colt Fletcher Maddox, also known as Ironside, president of the Iron Covenant Riders, Nevada chapter. The package contained the DEA case files, the operation name, the identity Colt had operated under, the years that details the scope of what he had done and for whom and how. Prescott Lund had released it exactly as he had threatened to. He had done it the moment it became clear that the rest of the plan had failed, and this was the only card left. The 11 journalists received the package at 9:15. What Lund did not know, because Darla Westbrook had been very careful about what she shared and with whom, and when, was that 48 hours earlier she had sat across a table from an Associated Press reporter named Margaret Fenwick, who had been covering federal corruption cases for 22 years and understood exactly what she was being given and what to do with it. Westbrook had told Margaret Fenwick everything, the full context, the DEA work, the Scorpions operation, what it had cost Colt in terms of reputation and safety, and the particular form of loneliness that came from living as someone else for years at a stretch. She had told her about Dot Maddox and what had been done to her and how that event had been the catalyst that finally broke open a federal case that had been building for 6 months. She had told her in language that she had chosen with care that the man the Farrell family was about to try to characterize as a rat and a traitor was in actual fact the only person in Silver Ridge who had been willing to stand up when everyone else had been made too afraid to move. Margaret Fenwick's story had been written. It had been edited. It had been reviewed by a P's legal team. It published at 9:08, 7 minutes before Lund's package hit 11 inboxes. The headline was precise and unambiguous and ran on every major news platform within the hour. Motorcycle Club president who exposed Nevada corruption was once deep cover, DEA. His own mother became the catalyst. The story that followed was not the story Prescott Lund had intended to tell. It was the true story, which was a different thing entirely. And it traveled the way true stories travel when they are delivered at the right moment, which is to say it traveled everywhere, and it traveled fast. By noon, Colt Maddox's phone had received 47 calls from numbers he did not recognize, and 14 from numbers he did, including one from a DEA field supervisor in Las Vegas, who said in a voice that contained something that might have been relief, "We've been wanting to do this for 3 years and never had the right moment." He also received at 11:46 a text message from a number registered in Flagstaff, Arizona. It said only, "We stand down. No beef with Iron Covenant." It was signed with a name he recognized as the president of the Scorpion Ridge Riders. He showed it to Diesel, who read it and handed the phone back without comment. Whatever arrangement the Scorpions had believed they had with the Farrell family had been predicated on the Farrell family being in a position to deliver something. The Farrell family was now in federal custody. The predicate was gone. Colt put his phone in his pocket and went to the hospital to bring his mother home. The trials moved at the pace that federal proceedings moved, which was measured and deliberate, and without much regard for anyone's desire for resolution. There were 3 of them running in sequence through the winter and into the spring. Colt attended every day. He sat in the back row of the courtroom in his street clothes, not his vest, because Harlan Crane had said very politely that the vest sent a message, and that the message they wanted this courtroom to receive was not about clubs and codes, but about a family and a town, and Colt had agreed and left the vest in the truck every morning. He sat in the back and he watched. Agatha Whitfield testified for 4 hours, walking the jury through 3 years of documentation with the quiet authority of a woman who had taught history long enough to understand that facts were not self-explanatory, but that the right person presenting them in the right order could make them feel as inevitable as gravity. The corporate filings, the pattern of property acquisitions, the timeline of pressure applied to business owners, and the timeline of their capitulation. She presented it all with the patience of someone who had been waiting a very long time to say it in a room where it would be recorded. Walt Garber testified about his shop. He showed the photographs, the spray paint, the damaged tanks, the security footage. He said what he had said to Colt the afternoon after the assault, about 22 years in the Navy and building something from nothing and not being afraid in his own shop. And he said it in front of 12 jurors with the same steadiness with which he had said it in his back office, because Walt Garber had decided the kind of man he was going to be and did not require an audience to maintain it. Wren Tillman testified about her windows and her machines and the week she was closed for repairs and the margins that did not absorb a week of closure easily. She was precise and clear, and when the defense attorney attempted to suggest that the vandalism could have been random, she looked at him across the courtroom with the particular patience of a woman who had spent 20 years running a business alone and said there is nothing random about a man who tells you that you will regret being unfriendly and 3 days later your front windows are gone. Nothing at all. Dot Maddox testified in the Tanner Farrell trial. She wore her powder blue uniform. She had asked to wear it, and no one had seen any reason to say no. She sat in the witness stand and she described the morning of October 8th in the careful and specific detail of someone who had thought about it every day since it happened and understood that the thinking was not the same as dwelling that some things needed to be examined clearly before they could be carried properly. She described the coffee and the hands in the plastic container. She described what it felt like when the centipede entered her ear canal, and she described it with a plainness that was more devastating than any heightened language would have been, because it did not ask the jury to feel a particular thing, but simply reported what had occurred and trusted them to understand what it meant. She was on the stand for 2.5 hours. When she was done, she looked at Tanner Farrell across the courtroom. He was 32 years old and he was in a suit. His father's money had paid for, the last time it would be able to pay for things like that. And he had been looking at his hands, or at his attorney, for most of the proceedings, the posture of someone who had discovered that consequences were real and was working out what to do with the discovery. He looked up when Dot looked at him. He held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then he looked away. Dot stepped down from the witness stand with the deliberate care of a 76-year-old woman who had been through something that would have diminished a person of lesser constitution and had decided not to be diminished, and she walked back to her seat beside Colt, and he put his hand over hers without speaking, and she squeezed it once and then let go. Clifton Farrell did not testify in his own defense. His attorneys made arguments that were technically competent and substantively insufficient because the evidence against him was the kind of evidence that does not leave interpretive gaps of the size required for a reasonable doubt defense to inhabit. The financial records from Crestline properties seized in the raids showed 2,200 transactions over 8 years, and the pattern of those transactions told a story that did not require interpretation so much as simple reading. The communications on the seized computers and phones included 41 exchanges between Farrell and Colfax relating directly to business owners who were resisting property sales in language that was careful in the way that guilty people's language is careful, elliptical, and elusive, but consistent enough across 41 instances to constitute a vocabulary of intent. Gary Boland, testifying under his cooperation agreement, described in specific terms the conversation he had been part of on the afternoon of May 3, 2018, in Clifton Farrell's office on County Road, in which the phrase that had been used was not "start the fire and not burn the house down," but the phrase that had been used was that the Mercer situation needed a permanent resolution and that this resolution needed to happen in a way that could not be traced back to anyone in that room. He testified that he had understood what was being asked of him. He testified that he had made a decision he could not undo and had lived inside the consequences of that decision for 6 years, and that coming here was the only thing he could still do that was honest. The jury deliberated for 11 hours over 2 days. They returned guilty verdicts on all counts. The judge was a woman in her late 50s named Hartwell, who had grown up in a town smaller than Silver Ridge and had driven past it twice on the way to her first job out of law school, and had some familiarity, therefore, with what a county looked like when power was concentrated in the wrong hands for too long. She sentenced Clifton Farrell to 25 years in federal custody with no possibility of early release. She sentenced him with the even careful language of someone who had thought about it and had more to say than the occasion required, and chose restraint instead. As the marshals moved to escort Farrell from the courtroom, he turned his head one last time. He was not looking at his attorney. He was not looking at the jury. He looked toward the back of the courtroom, and Colt held the look, and there was nothing dramatic about what passed between them. No final reckoning, no closing statement of the kind that moments like this invited. There was only 2 men who had known the same person and made different choices about what that person's life had meant. Then Farrell turned away and went with the marshals, and that was the end of it. Tanner Farrell received 15 years. Under Nevada statute, the elder abuse enhancement applied, in the presence of a dangerous animal used as a weapon, added additional counts that the prosecution had argued carefully and the jury had accepted. The defense presented the substance dependency argument. The prosecution played 30 seconds of Kyle Sutton's video, the part where Tanner was laughing and rested, 15 years. Eligible for parole review after 10 with demonstrated rehabilitation, which was language that covered a possibility without constituting a promise. Gary Boland received 12 years. His cooperation had been substantial and documented, and the federal prosecutor noted it for the record and recommended the reduction from the original charge that his agreement allowed. He went without drama. He was a man who had been waiting for this for a very long time and who found, as some men do, that the end of waiting was its own form of relief. Silas Colfax received 8 years, his cooperation having been more limited and his culpability more extensive than his initial posture suggested, and the judge noted that a man who held the position of sheriff and used it to serve the interests of a single powerful family rather than the community that had trusted him bore a particular kind of responsibility that the law recognized with particular emphasis. In the front row of the courtroom for each of these sentencings sat 2 women. One of them was Calvin Mercer's widow, whose name was Louise, and who had come to every day of proceedings with the composed and unyielding attention of a woman who understood that this was the closest she was going to come to the thing she had actually needed, which was her husband back, and who had decided that closest was not nothing. Beside her in each session sat Agatha Whitfield, who had started the documentation 3 years ago in her living room with a banker's box and the conviction that someone needed to keep track. Neither woman wept publicly. Both of them deserved to. Silver Ridge did not transform overnight. That was not how towns worked. The structures that power built over 8 years did not dissolve in the weeks after the structure's builder was removed from them. There were permits to unsnarl and contracts to examine and financial arrangements that had seemed like the only available option to people operating under duress and now needed to be looked at in the clearer light of an altered situation. There was a special election for an interim mayor to fill the vacancy left by Farrell's removal from office, with the election scheduled for November and 3 candidates on the ballot. Agatha Whitfield had not intended to be one of them. She said this to multiple people in the weeks leading up to the filing deadline, and she said it with the conviction of someone who genuinely meant it. She was 68 years old. She was a retired school teacher. She had no political experience and no particular desire for it. The people who came to her door said things like, "You kept track when nobody else would." They said things like, "You knew what was happening and you held on to it and you waited and then you did something." They said things like, "That's exactly the kind of person who should be in that office." She filed on the last day. She won with 67% of the vote, which in a 4-person race was the kind of margin that made a statement about what the town felt it had been missing and what it now wanted. On the morning of her first day as interim mayor, she went to the office on County Road and stood in the doorway of Clifton Farrell's former office for a moment, looking at the desk and the shelves and the window that looked out over the parking lot and beyond that Silver Ridge. Then she went in and moved the desk so it faced the window instead of the door, a small change, a matter of where you looked while you worked, and she sat down and opened the first file. 6 months after the raids on a Saturday morning in April, when the Nevada desert was doing what it did in April, which was to remind everyone that beauty was possible, even in hard country, Maddox and Garber Custom Motorcycles opened its doors for the first time. The building was on the south edge of town, adjacent to what had been Dutch Garber's welding shop, and expanded into the vacant lot beside it, a lot that had been part of the Crestline Properties portfolio and had been released back to the community at assessed value through the federal asset forfeiture process. The expansion had required permits, and the permits had been processed in 11 days by the new interim mayor's office, which was slightly faster than average, but not anomalous, which was how it should be. The sign above the door was simple: dark iron letters on a pale background, the kind that would last. Walt Garber stood inside the main bay looking at the tools arranged on their pegboards. The bikes in the early stages of restoration lined up along the wall, the smell of motor oil and fresh paint, and the particular possibility of a space that was new and was about to become something. He was 72 years old, and his hands still worked, and his eyes were still good, and he had, as it turned out, been waiting for a partner for some time without exactly knowing it. He measured the door frame with a tape measure he had been using since 1986 and wrote the number in his notebook. Colt watched him from across the bay. Dot was outside with a ribbon borrowed from the post office, waiting for whoever was going to arrive and witness the moment. She was wearing her powder blue uniform because it was Saturday, and she was due at Crestline Diner at noon, and she saw no reason to change clothes twice. Her ear had healed. The doctor said it had healed well, some scarring in the canal, permanent reduction in hearing acuity on the right side, but nothing that required intervention beyond the adjustment of living with it, which was the kind of adjustment Maddox made without making much of it. They came throughout the morning. Ren Tillman came and brought coffee from the diner down the road. Agatha Whitfield came in her capacity as a friend rather than as interim mayor, though the distinction was somewhat academic. Bishop Waverly came, and Chains Pruitt and Diesel Skaggs and members from the visiting chapters who had been present during the week of the warrants and who had stayed in occasional contact since. Louise Mercer came with her nephew Eli, and Eli shook Colt's hand and said that he had been accepted to the engineering program at University of Nevada, Reno, and that the scholarship from the Crestline Asset Forfeiture Fund was going to cover most of it and that he was going to make something of it, and Colt said he had no doubt, and he meant it. Wendell Okafor came last, which was characteristic of him arriving after the main moment, with the unostentatious timing of a man who had been running a diner for 30 years and understood that sometimes the most important thing you could do was show up after the crowd had thinned. He found Colt near the door, and he shook his hand and held it for a moment longer than a handshake required. He said your father used to come into the diner every Thursday morning. Same booth, same order, same conversation about whatever needed attention in this town. He said it in the voice of someone telling a person something they should know. He said Fletcher had been coming in since before Wendell had bought the place from his father, which meant there was a quality of continuity to it that went beyond habit. He said he'd have had a lot to say about this morning. Colt said, yeah. Wendell said I told him once that his regular table would always be his, no charge for as long as he wanted it. Old habit. I do that for people who matter to the diner. He let go of Colt's hand. I'm extending that to you. Thursday mornings, same booth, same offer. Colt looked at him. He said, I'll be there. The party lasted into the early afternoon. People came and went in the way of small-town gatherings, the easy accumulation and dispersal of people who knew each other well enough not to require occasion to justify the time together. Someone brought food. Someone brought more coffee. The bikes on the workshop floor were discussed and admired, and the early restoration work assessed by a series of people who knew enough to have opinions and were comfortable expressing them. Gradually, the afternoon light shifted, and people began to leave, and the space emptied in the way spaces empty when the thing they were gathered for has happened, and the hours ahead belonged to something quieter. By 6 o'clock, Colt was alone in the garage. He had not planned to stay. He had told himself he would lock up and follow Dutch back across town for dinner. But Dutch had gone on ahead when Colt said he would be right behind him, and right behind him had become 15 minutes, and 15 minutes had become an hour. And now he was sitting on a stool in the center of the main bay with the lights on and the garage doors open to the April evening and the desert going purple and gold outside. Above the main workbench, Fletcher Maddox looked down from a photograph. It was the one from 1987, the same one that hung on the wall of the Iron Covenant clubhouse, the image of a man in his 50s standing beside a motorcycle with his arms crossed, and that particular smile that said he knew something you did not and was entirely at peace with the fact that you would figure it out eventually. Below the photograph on the small shelf Colt had mounted himself during the renovation was the Iron Covenant pin, the original. The one cast in 1958, Fletcher's hands working the metal. It sat on the shelf in the way that objects sit when they have been given the right place still and present and somehow larger than their physical dimensions. Colt looked at his father's face for a long time. He thought about 30 years of road, about the particular arithmetic of a life built on motion, how motion accumulated, and how the miles added up, and how the thing you were moving away from had a way of traveling with you, regardless of the speed or the distance, because some things were not geographical. He thought about a letter written in 1989 and never sent, about a pin on a desk, about two men with shovels in 1956 on a piece of ground that was going to become something worth having. He thought about his mother in her hospital bed trying to smile, and about the sound her voice made when she said it was just boys being stupid, the particular resigned familiarity of a woman who understood exactly what had happened and what it cost and was trying to protect him from the weight of it by minimizing her own. He thought about what it had taken to ride back into Silver Ridge. Not the physical ride, the 12-mile stretch of Highway 50 from the compound that was nothing. He thought about the other ride, the one that had taken 30 years, the long circuit away from a promise made to a dying man in a garage, not unlike this one, and the long arc back to the moment when the promise could no longer be deferred. He said out loud to the photograph, "We built it right this time, Dad." He said the way you always wanted. His voice did not shake. He had not expected it to, but there was something clarifying about saying it, the way there was something clarifying about all the things you said to the dead when you were finally ready to say them. The desert was doing what it did at dusk, which was to insist on its own scale. The mountains in the distance, the sky coming down through every shade of its range before settling into dark. The stars beginning first one, then several. Then the whole arrangement, the high-altitude Nevada sky, laying out its full inventory, the way it did on clear nights, which was as though it had an obligation to the people below it to be as complete as possible. Colt sat in the silence of the garage and breathed it. His phone buzzed once. He looked at it. A text from Darla Westbrook. 4 words. Farrell's appeal was denied. He put the phone down. He sat for another few minutes. Then he stood, turned off the lights, and walked outside. His Road King was in the lot, the only bike remaining, the chrome catching the last horizontal light of the day. He stood beside it and put his hand on the tank in the familiar way, the way you greet something you have traveled long distances with and trusted absolutely. The metal was still warm from the afternoon sun. He mounted up, started the engine, listened to it settle into its voice. He pulled out of the lot and onto the road, and he headed west on Highway 50 into the last red edge of the day, going down behind the Sierra Nevadas, the mountains going dark at their edges, the road opening ahead of him as it always had, as it always would, as long as he wanted it to. He rode to the city limit sign. He rode past it. He went another quarter mile, and then he slowed and he stopped. And he sat on the shoulder of Highway 50 in the gathering dark and with the engine idling and the desert spread out around him in every direction, and the sign that said Silver Ridge elevation, 5,810 feet, population 4,000, visible behind him in the mirror. He looked at it for a moment. Then he made a U-turn. He rode back. He rode back past the sign, back into Silver Bridge, back down Main Street, past Crestline Diner, where Dot was finishing her shift, past the community building, where the lights in Agatha Whitfield's office were still on, because some people understood that the work of a place never actually stopped, past the hardware store, and the bakery and the buildings that had been Farrell's, and were now the town's again. And he rode back to the garage on the south edge of town and parked in front of it and killed the engine. He sat in the quiet for a moment. He looked at the sign above the door. Maddox and Garber Custom Motorcycles. His father had wanted a garage. He had one. The road had not disappeared. It was still out there, still running east and west into distances that the Nevada desert made feel genuinely infinite. It would be there tomorrow and the day after, and every day he chose to ride it. But it had taken him 30 years to understand something that Fletcher had probably known all along, which was that the road was not a destination, and it was not an escape, and it was not the point. The road was what you rode when you needed to think, and what you rode when you were moving towards something, and what you eventually turned around on when you had figured out where you actually needed to be. He was 58 years old. He had rebuilt more engines than he could count. He had ridden through every state west of the Mississippi and some east of it. He had lived as someone else for years and come back to himself. He had watched his father die and ridden away from the thing his father had asked him to protect, and he had come back to it slowly on the long road that had brought him here. He was back. He got off the bike. He walked inside. He turned on one light, the one above the workbench, the one that illuminated his father's photograph and the pin on the shelf below it. He sat back down on the stool. He thought about Dot, who would be home by 9, who would make tea and leave the porch light on whether or not she knew he was coming, because she had been doing that since he was 17, and she was not going to stop now. He thought about Dutch, who would be in tomorrow at 7:30, who had already identified the next 3 projects and had opinions about the carburetor situation on the Heritage Softail that he was going to share at length and was probably right about. He thought about the Thursday morning booth at Crestline Diner that Wendell was holding for him. He thought about Eli Mercer in Reno, in the fall, sitting in an engineering classroom with a scholarship that had come from the wreckage of the thing that had taken his uncle, and learning to build something that would last. He thought about Agatha Whitfield at her desk on County Road documents in front of her, the window open, the town visible through it working. He thought about his father's hands in old photographs, always occupied, always in the middle of something, and he looked at his own hands in the light from the workbench lamp, and he thought that they looked this evening like those hands, like Fletcher Maddox's hands, like the hands of a man who knew where he was and what he was doing and intended to keep doing it for as long as he was able. My father left me 2 things, a promise I was slow to keep, and a town he believed in when it was hard to believe. Turns out the road was just what I needed to ride before I could find my way back. He sat in the garage with the light on and the desert dark around it and the stars overhead doing what Nevada stars did, which was everything, and he was home, and it was quiet, and it was enough. At what point does a man choose power over the people who trusted him? And is there a moment when it is too late to choose differently? Or is there always one last turn in the road?